My name is Phil Capin. I'm an assistant professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and welcome to the next installment in our Usable Knowledge Live Literacy Insights series. Our goal in this series is to share evidence-based guidance from the science of reading to practitioners. For those that have been able to participate in past sessions, in our first session, you may recall we defined the science of reading as a body of evidence that describe both how reading develops and how instruction can support that development. It offers information that can inform instruction related to foundational skills like phonics and phonemic awareness, but also to broader skills such as reading comprehension. It also yields insights for students broadly and provides specific insights for particular populations of students. In today's session, we're going to focus on multilingual learners. Across the US, educators are teaching students who are reading and writing in English while also developing in other languages. These multilingual students bring rich linguistic and cultural knowledge, along with all the other wonderful qualities that children offer. Of course, some multilingual students will come to school with strong English language proficiency and perform very well right away and continue to do well. Others may face the dual challenge of learning English as an additional language while also developing academic skills across content areas. So today we're asking, how can the science of reading meaningfully inform instruction for multilingual learners, recognizing there's a lot of heterogeneity within this population? We have lots of people here today. Thank you for being here. Many of you are practitioners or maybe parents. And I hope as we have this conversation, you can think about the levers that you hold for creating change for multilingual learners. And hopefully today's learning will contribute to ways in which you can improve the lives of multilingual students. Okay. So I'm excited to introduce our guests. We have two guests on today's episode. Our first guest is Paola Uccelli. She is a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, whose scholarship focuses on the development of multilingual and monolingual students' language and literacy development. And she's particularly interested in the development of language skills needed for engaging in complex reading and writing across the grades. Thank you for being here, Paola.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for inviting and thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Our second guest is Claude Goldenberg. He's a professor emeritus at Stanford University, and his research examines ways to promote academic achievement. His research has explored the value of bilingual education, as well as ways to advance reading outcomes among multilingual learners. Welcome, Claude.
Phil, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think this is a great series you're doing, so happy to be part of it.
Well, thanks again. So we're going to start with a topic that I know we care a lot about, the three of us, and it's related to bilingual education. So a question that I often receive from educators and policymakers is about the value of bilingual education. Should we teach students in their home language, in English, or in both? And I think sometimes people wonder, is there some trade-off here? Does time spent in the first language take away from English, or can it actually support English language development? So Claude, I know you've thought a lot about this. What are some key insights that educators should know from research about bilingual instruction and its role in supporting students' academic development?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Phil. It's a good place to start. A lot of times bilingual education sort of comes at the end and, oh yeah, don't forget about bilingual education. But it's a good starting point. But at the same time, it's something that really requires its own sort of dedicated time because newsflash, it's a complicated question. There are different types of bilingual education. There's short-term bilingual education that is actually meant to be transitional. You support in the home language until kids learn enough English to then transition over to English. The intent is not bilingualism and biliteracy. I think the most fruitful way to approach bilingual education as a way that schools can contribute to bilingualism and biliteracy, a goal that I think we should all support, and not just for English language learners, but for English speakers as well, under the premise that being bilingual and biliterate is frankly an advantage. And it's something that kids and people around the world have. They have bilingualism. They have biliteracy. It is absolutely possible to educate individuals to be multilingual, but you have to take a long-term view. It's not something that happens in 1, 2, 3 years, which is how transitional bilingual education, short-term bilingual education approaches it. So we need to think in terms of long-term. where you have an opportunity for the home language to be developed and elaborated, language and literacy, and for the second language, which in the United States is English, to be elaborated and to be learned. If we do this, if we approach it in this way, then you see a net benefit for both the home language and, of course, for the development of English language and literacy. So we need to orient bilingual education as an opportunity for linguistic and literacy enrichment for the entire population, not just for English language learners, although it is for them as well.
Yeah, so many good points there. The focus on not only bilingualism, but biliteracy, the long-term commitment that we have to have for it to be successful. I know, Paola, you've been thinking a lot about this as well. Is there anything you'd like to add or underscore?
Yeah, Phil, I would completely agree with everything that Claude just said. And perhaps I'll add that this is a critical question, not only for the US, but actually globally, and not only for schools, but also for parents. We have a report of, UNESCO and the World Bank have estimated that over 370 million children around the world are taught at school in a language that is not the language they know best. And so they actually point to this as one contributing factor of the current global learning crisis. Why? Because in fact, research tells us that high quality and, to Claude's point, long-term home language instruction that is embedded in bilingual education actually supports learning a new language instead of making it harder, right? For parents, and I emphasize this because I get this question a lot, decades of developmental research are very clear in showing that if you're a parent, you're actually supporting your children best when you are using the language that you know best, because that allows you to provide emotionally supportive and cognitively engaging interaction. So, if you're a parent who's most comfortable in Spanish, like I've been with my kids, then you'll offer richer conversations, more elaborate stories. You connect emotionally with your kids, typically much better in the language you know best, right? And again, the point that whatever children learn in their first language interactions actually supports their learning of a second language, like how a story works or how to explain an idea or even how print works, right? So even if kids go into monolingual instruction, which is, often what happens at the end, speaking to your child in the language you know best is going to offer children the best environment. And I would say just a quick addition to what Claude says, that bilingual education, of course, gives structured opportunities for kids to develop biliteracy in long-term bilingual education. And that becomes a powerful ally for parents who want their kids to maintain their home language, of course. Otherwise, it's likely, their kids might lose their home language in a society where their home language is not the dominant language, right? But I would just emphasize a point that is also related to the long view that Claude was talking about, which is bilingual education is not only about which language of instruction, it's about the quality of instruction. And so, like any educational programs, bilingual programs need to be of high quality, right? And when that happens, we have very recent rigorous studies from the US to South Africa showing that high quality bilingual education actually produces positive impacts. But importantly, to the long view that Claude was highlighting, that happens over the years. So we need to follow kids to the upper elementary and to the middle school years when the benefits of bilingual education truly emerge. So that's for...
No, that's so helpful. So, like anything, it has to be high quality and maybe it needs to be long term. And there's certain conditions under which these programs are going to be most effective. But when implemented well, it sounds like there's academic benefits. There's also the cultural benefits for the
course.
preservation of and these linguistic benefits. And I think there's also economic benefits to being bilingual. And so, I think despite our shared belief in the value of bilingual education, only a small number of students at least in the US, receive bilingual or dual language instruction. And so there's probably practitioners and others on this webinar who are providing instruction in English only contexts. And so maybe we could think a little bit about how to best support multilingual learners in English instruction. And that's actually a question that matters both for bilingual educators who are going to provide instruction in English, at least in the US, and for those teaching in English only environments. And so, Claude, maybe we could start with you. When you look at the science of reading and this body of research, what does it tell us about the best ways to support multilingual learners in the elementary grades?
Right. Well, yes, your point is well made, Phil. In fact, I'd go further and I'd say, even if you're in bilingual education, even if you're teaching in bilingual education, you will be instructing students who are learning to read and write in English as they're learning to speak the language. So that even if you're in bilingual education and receiving home language instruction, sooner or later, and depends on what, there are different bilingual education models, which just kind of complicates things. But even if you're like in a sequential bilingual education program, where first you learn in your primary language, you learn literacy, and that's the kind that I taught in when I taught first grade. You learn to read and write in your first language, and then you transition over to English, and Spanish is just sort of left by the wayside. Even when you transition into English, you're still, as an English learner, because English learners normally take 5, 6, sometimes longer years to become fully proficient in English. So even in bilingual education, you will be teaching students who need to learn to read and write in language they're simultaneously learning to speak and understand. So that's universal. And I think the important thing to understand, to me, the biggest through line here is that learning to read and write in a language you're simultaneously learning to understand and speak is very, very similar. It's actually almost identical to learning to read and write in a language you already know. The critical difference is, if you're learning to speak the language that you're learning to read and write, you need active support and instruction in that language, so that as you're learning literacy skills in English, you're also learning the oral language skills that will support literacy. I mean, literacy is not just decoding or comprehension. I mean, that binary, if we could get rid of it, I think we would catapult into the future in much better shape. Because what you have to understand, it's both. You need those foundational skills, Phil, that you led the program off with, absolutely. But if those foundational skills don't connect to a robust language system with background knowledge and metacognitive skills and all those goodies that we like to talk about, if those foundational skills don't connect with those, it's to no end. It's a dead end. It's all you can do is decode something meaningless. Where have you got with that? But you have to understand that kids who are learning to read and write in whatever language need to understand how the spelling system, the orthography, connects to the sound system, the phonology, and then how that connection connects to the language system. And if you don't know the language system of the language you're learning to read and write in, if you don't know the phonology of the language you're learning to read and write in, you can't create those connections called, the literacy circuit or the reading. I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm not get off on neuroscientific stuff, but there's something called the literacy circuit that's got to be created between the sounds of the language, the written representation, and the meaning. And if you don't know the language orally and semantically, you can't connect those foundational skills to read. So it's extremely important that the same things have to be learned by multilingual learners, but you need to support them in learning the oral language, which includes the semantics and the phonology. That's the key difference. Otherwise, they got to learn everything that everybody else got to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's such a key point. I think we sometimes struggle when I was a teacher, do I need to provide a different set of practices to my multilingual students? And the truth, as you say, is that they're learning to read the same language as their peers, and the process for learning to read is going to be very similar, but they'll need particular supports with that semantic component. And good phonics instruction should involve not just orthography and phonology, but that semantic piece. So that's really important.
Absolutely, because you want to connect to meaning. The word recognition requires that you already have cognized the word. You can't recognize words if you haven't seen them before, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Right. So Paula, you've been thinking a lot about students that are adolescents, so adolescent multilingual students. What are some key insights from your research that you think would be really beneficial for educators of adolescents to know about?
Yeah, so Phil, as you know, my recent research has been motivated, I would say, by two educational puzzles, right? First, in the US, many schools successfully help multilingual students move from beginning to intermediate English proficiency. But what remains much harder is to support adolescents to move from intermediate to grade level English proficiency, right? And the second puzzle for me is about developing readers. And what we see is large proportions, actually, of both multilingual and monolingual adolescents who have been successful readers up to grade 3 or 4. And suddenly they start to struggle with reading in the upper elementary and middle school years, right? Interestingly, this pattern we see in many countries and in many languages, actually, not only in the US and not only in English. So I would say across my own work and that of many, many others, two findings that are relevant to these puzzles keep showing up. And I think first, even within a single classroom, multilingual and monolingual adolescents bring very different language histories, strengths, and needs. So teachers today have to address many different language and literacy needs, even within a single classroom and even in the middle grades, right? And second, we need, I think to build on Claude's point, students learn language by using language, and they grow as readers when they interact with others through dialogue. So we used to think, even in the field, that students could just absorb language by listening, right? The input hypothesis. We know that that's not the case, that they grow as speakers and as readers when they get to use the language, to talk, to ask questions, to explain their thinking, to read texts that matter to them, to, try out new words and structures, but in tasks that are authentic and demanding, actually. So I would say those two findings have big implications for classrooms, because to reach academic excellence and equity, truly all students will need opportunities to use the language regularly, right? And so all students bring rich language resources that have served them well throughout their development, but they don't all arrive with the same language experiences. And what happens is around fourth grade, content area texts and tasks begin to place new language demands on students. And these are demands that are different from those in the early grades and different from, the language we use when we are, outside of school or in colloquial conversations. And let me say one more thing, which is in my work, what we have found is that beyond sort of the discipline-specific language, the technical terms like photosynthesis in science, right? Content area texts actually have lots of general academic words and structures that no single teacher feels responsible for teaching, precisely because they are not discipline specific, right? For example, connecting words like consequently or nevertheless, or phrases like it is unlikely that, these appear across science, social studies, and language arts, and they serve important purposes. But, these are meant to be important signals and scaffolds to understand text, right? But for kids who don't know them, they become major obstacles. And so we need to pay attention to that. And we know that they are hard to pick up just from context and from listening, for sure. So I would say one key insight is that many words and language structures used frequently across content area texts pose challenges both for English learning multilinguals and for monolingual developing readers, right? And again, this is a pattern we've seen in many countries and in many languages, in Spanish, in Portuguese, in English. So, we cannot overlook individual differences in language, in the languages that kids bring, monolingual or multilingual, or overlook the demands of content area texts and tasks, because we not only miss the opportunities to support students, but we might actually exacerbate the precise inequalities that we hope education will challenge, right?
I mean, can I just say that goes into the issue of quality of the program. I mean, one key determiner of quality of program is the quality of the instruction, the direct instruction, the direct teaching. Now, there are many different kinds of teaching, direct, indirect, and so forth, but explicit direct instruction to help kids learn what they need to learn is an indispensable tool. And I find in a lot of multilingual English learner classrooms, the emphasis on direct, explicit instruction to help kids understand and acquire the skills tends to get downplayed. Now, why that is, we can get into it. There's all sorts of epistemological and yada, yada. But quality, direct, explicit instruction that helps kids understand what they need to understand while allowing exploration. I don't mean a rigid drill, it gets criticized and caricatured as drill and kill and those sort of things that sort of distract us from the task at hand. But the kind of thing that Paola was identifying, both for monolingual kids, unilingual kids, bilingual, multilingual, quality instruction that really help kids learn what they need to learn is an indispensable part, regardless of language that you speak at home or anywhere else. That is indispensable.
Yeah. No, I think that's really critical. And it's not at odds with this idea that students learn through language, because you can provide explicit and systematic instruction about, for instance, connectives, as you talked about, Paola. And then you give them lots of opportunities to practice using this in oral and written discourse. And so these things are not at odds with each other.
Absolutely.
I think one thing that I struggled with as a teacher, I taught on the border of California and Mexico. And so almost all the students I taught were multilingual, was thinking about how to differentiate instruction. I think I'm of the belief now that we should consider designing our core instruction to support the needs of multilingual students, because the instructional supports that are critical to their learning are also productive for other students. You think about making content relevant to students' lives, to providing academic language supports, to making sure that there's lots of opportunities for students to engage with one another in a social learning experience. And so I think, Paola, you sometimes think about this the same way. What are some of the key practices that you would like, general ed teachers to be focused on for all students?
Yeah. I would completely concur with you, Phil, on that idea. I always tell my students, multilingual learners are among the students who are pushing our thinking and our creativity the most in this mobile world. But what we learn with them actually advances education for all, right? So I totally agree on that. I would say, perhaps I'll point to two or three practices. I would say first, as an educator, don't wait for English proficiency or grade level reading before engaging your students with rich content and complex text, right? Sometimes we think we cannot expose kids until their English catches up. But in fact, students who are still developing grade level English proficiency or reading proficiency are, even most urgently than others, in need of participation in these content-rich discussions and learning, right? So I think one of the things that might be most counterintuitive from research is that it is precisely in the context of discussion, reading and writing about rich content with demanding reasoning skills that language is learned more effectively. But of course, in that case, exactly as Claude was pointing out a few minutes ago, language scaffolds and the teacher as mediator become absolutely key, right? So I would say sort of the complementary practice is building these language scaffolds. And instead of, putting, explicit instruction and authentic use against one another, they are complementary. And I think the language scaffolds need to be felt by students like tools to sharpen their own ideas and their learning, not as tests or drills, right? So in a sense, as Claude was saying, as teachers, we absolutely need to know which vocabulary and language structures to teach, right? But students should experience those as tools for thinking and communicating and learning, not as isolated drills. So, but that doesn't mean that explicit instruction doesn't have a place. I think actually, it's best to offer short, focused scaffolds on powerful words and language structures. For example, stopping briefly in an interactive reading to clarify a few text fragments, or focusing on a sentence that you extract from the text strategically to unpack its language and its meaning with students, or doing a quick mini lesson on how a text organizes an argument, for example. But then to the point that you were highlighting, Phil, students need to immediately use language and dialogue for real, engaging, and cognitively demanding tasks, because we know it's when they get lots of chances to use language in authentic grade level work that they will actually internalize and learn those structures and words, right? And I would say also, when we offer this scaffold, sometimes as language teachers, we're so focused on improving language, but we always have to remember to listen to students' ideas first. First, the meanings, then we can focus on sort of the expansion. But when we listen to kids, they listen to us, and then they take more risks in language learning, and that language can be built on the language that they have, right? And perhaps I would say a third, very quickly, that is, to create low risk, high thinking routines like open questions, group problem solving that invite all students into dialogue and explicitly value and welcome their home language as tools for thinking, connecting, and making sense of complex ideas, right? I could say more, but I know we have little time.
No, there's so much I want to underscore there, but I think if I just underscore one thing, it's that we should engage all students, and particularly multilingual students, in engaging in complex tasks, recognizing that language is the byproduct. It occurs through the engagement with complex tasks. There may need to be some scaffolds, but still the goal needs to be the same, this complex task. It's not a prerequisite for engaging in those activities. I want to end by looking ahead, and we might just have time for one more question for you, Claude. Many states and districts are currently in the process of revising their literacy policies and practices to align with reading science. If there's one piece of advice that you could share with leaders about making sure that these changes and reforms support multilingual learners, what would that advice be?
I'm going to give you a twofer, Phil, very briefly. The first one is break down that binary between foundational skills versus language and comprehension and meaning, as Paola was pointing out. I mean, that is so harmful to our thinking about this. I mean, the two can be taught distinctly. Foundational skills is a different type of learning than language, background knowledge, comprehension, but they have to converge. They have to be seen as an integrated whole, even though sometimes you have to separate them to really focus on them. You need to get past this fatal binary. The other thing, which I said before and I want to end on, is that English learners need to learn exactly the same thing that non-English learners, monolingual speakers. At the beginning of literacy, foundational literacy skills, combine that with language, and throughout the developmental sequence, throughout school, they need to learn the same things, but they need to be supported in learning the English language. That is the language that's being used to teach them, and they have to learn the language as they're learning the skills. That is a tougher lift for them, but the same idea, the same concepts, the same content has got to be offered them and taught to them, but with that very important English language development support. That would be the through line that I would argue we need to keep in mind at all stages of language and literacy development.
Excellent. Well, I'll let that be our final word. Just to wrap up, I want to say thank you, Paola and Claude, for your contributions to the science of reading for multilingual students and for sharing those contributions today. I want to say thanks as well to those who joined the webinar. We will send some follow-up materials after the webinar, and we also invite you to join our next installment. We'll have it'll occur on June 3rd, and it'll be with a Harvard faculty member, Ying Zhu, who focuses on the intersection between artificial intelligence and literacy. And so we're going to talk about, how do we best support and raise readers in a digital age? So again, thanks for joining, and thanks for all you're doing for students out there.